Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond, and we have a small amount left in chapter 7, and then we will begin chapter 8. We'll probably get halfway through chapter 8 and have to finish it up on the next episode, and that will conclude the first part of this book. Okay, let's continue reading. After receiving the eviction notice, it took Teddy a couple days to decide it was time to go home to Tennessee. He called one of his sisters, who told him that she'd be sending her husband up with the van. Teddy sent her a $500 money order. Quote, I don't want to go to them broke, end quote, he told Scott, which also told him his money was gone. Scott saw that he needed a plan, so he rang up Pito, an old Narcotics Anonymous buddy, and asked if he had any work. Pito connected Scott with Myra, a take-no-shit lesbian from Puerto Rico, who offered him a job cleaning out foreclosed homes. Myra paid Scott and the other crewmen in cash. The amounts varied widely. Scott didn't understand or ask why. They gave scrappers the metal and sold some valuables here and there, hauling the rest to the dump. Scott was stunned by what people left behind. Sofas, computers, stainless steel ranges, children's clothes with the tags on them, tricycles, holiday decorations in basement bins, frozen pork chops, cans of green beans, sheeted mattresses, file cabinets, framed posters and prayers and inspirational verses, curtains, blouses on hangers, lawn mowers, pictures. Sometimes the houses were humble and squat with cracked windows and grease on the ceiling. Sometimes they were cavernous with thick carpet, master bathrooms, and back decks. To Scott, it felt like the whole city was being tossed out. Quote, sometimes you walk into a house and it's like they just walk out with the clothes on their back, end quote. Scott was saying over another breakfast beer with Teddy. It had been roughly a week since they had received their eviction notice. Quote, there's some profundity in that. There's some profundity in that I don't understand yet, end quote. Quote, I wish I could work, end quote, Teddy answered. Quote, I wish I could be outside and work, but the shape I'm in, end quote. Scott wasn't interested in the work, but the wreckage. Quote, I can't figure out what happened to the people, end quote, he continued. Quote, it's really, end quote, he let the word float. Quote, Scott, end quote, Teddy said, slowly turning toward him. Quote, you're just like my family. I hate to leave you, but I'm headed back home, end quote. Quote, I don't even like you, end quote, Scott responded with a grin. Quote, I know that's just a lie. I know you don't want to see me go, but I know you know it's got to be done, end quote. Around sunrise Saturday morning, a white van pulled up to the trailer. Scott placed a bag of Teddy's clothes and his fishing gear in the back and helped his old friend into the passenger seat. Teddy's bendless arm raised in a quiet goodbye, as if by string, as the van pulled away under a Harley Davidson orange sky. The following evening around dusk, while Scott was out with Myra's crew, people started raiding his trailer. Teddy was gone, and everyone in the trailer park knew that Scott would be soon too. They started small, taking shirts, movies, jackets, a backpack. Then they went for the larger items, carrying out the table, the couch, the crucifixion painting. Lorraine's brother-in-law, Lane, a skinny man with dark hair and a gold necklace, watched from his daisy yellow trailer. Quote, buzzards, end quote, he said, shaking his head. Quote, you better close your mouth when you sleep, or these people will steal the gold right out your teeth, end quote. When Scott got home that night and realized what had happened, he rushed to check if the plastic container in his room, the one stuffed with photographs, diplomas, and memories, hard evidence that he had once been someone else, was still there. It was. They had taken the bed but left the box. It felt like a gift. Scott then walked away slowly from room to room, noticing that what had been snatched and what was unwanted, even by the desperate. No one took the books or the Polaroid camera, but they had collected the empty beer cans to recycle. Scott fingered the remainders like he sometimes did in the foreclosed homes, studying them as if they were dug up artifacts or fossils. He thought of the last home he had cleaned out that night. From the outside, it looked like any other home. But inside, He had found a stripper's pole attached to a homemade stage, encircled by couches. Hardcore pornography was strewn about everywhere. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs. 2 were covered in more smut. Scott opened the door to find the third and stared down at a twin bed, toys, and half-finished homework. Most abandoned homes left him few clues about the people who had lived there. As he went about his work, Scott would fill in the rest, imagining laughter around the dinner table, sleeping faces in the morning, a man shaving in the bathroom. This last house told its own story. Thinking of that one bedroom, Scott sat down on his empty floor in his gutted-out trailer and wept. And that brings us to the end of chapter 7 and to the beginning of chapter 8, which is entitled Christmas in Room 400. We are on page 94, and this last chapter is the final chapter in the first part of Evicted. And what stands out to me in that very last passage from chapter 7 is just the loss, the pain, the suffering, all of these stories, these untold stories of that are being these untold stories that we are seeing through the vantage point of homes and through houses. Okay, let's continue. Chapter 8, Christmas in Room 400. Sharina decided to evict Arlene. The funeral and subsequent welfare sanction had put Arlene too far behind, $870. Sharina felt it was time to, quote, let go and move on to the next tenant, end quote. Earlier in the month, she had filed the paperwork and received a court date of December 23rd, which would be the last eviction court before Christmas that year. Sharina knew the courthouse would be packed. Many parents chose to take their chances with their landlords rather than face their children empty-handed on Christmas morning. A new tenant had already asked Sharina if a portion of her rent money could be returned so she could buy gifts. Sharina told her, quote, you got to have a house to put the Christmas tree and presents in. You've been knowing Christmas was coming 11 months ago, end quote. The night before Sharina and Arlene's date in eviction court, snow began to fall. When Milwaukeeans woke up the following morning, they found their city buried in it. People in parkas and knit hats shuffled along the sidewalks. Mothers with bundled up children huddled under bus stop awnings, shifting their weight from one leg to the other. The city's smokestacks billowed cotton-thick clouds of steam into a pale, pale sky. Holiday decorations dotted the north side. A black nativity, a snowman smiling from an abandoned lot. Sharina pulled up to the Milwaukee County Courthouse. The courthouse had been built in 1931, but made to look like it had always been there. Corinthian columns, taller and thicker than oak trunks, encircled the building, lifting its roof high above downtown. The building was enormous, with an imposing limestone facade on which the architects had etched in block letters, Vox Populi Vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. Sharina wondered if Arlene would show. Most of the time, tenants didn't, and Sharina preferred it that way. She had learned that it didn't matter how much kindness you had shown the tenant up to that point. Quote, all that stuff goes out the window, end quote, in court. Sharina had brought Arlene milk and groceries. She'd even had a worker deliver a stove that was sitting unused in one of her vacant units. But she knew that, once in front of the commissioner, Arlene was more likely to bring up the time the water heater went out or mention the hole in the window Quentin still hadn't fixed. Still, Sharina had called Arlene that morning to remind her about court. She didn't have to, but she had a soft spot for Arlene. Plus, Sharina worried more about the commissioners. She thought they were sympathetic to tenants and tried to block landlords with technicalities. Sharina had had a couple of cases thrown out on paperwork errors. When that happened, she had to start the eviction process all over again, which usually meant losing another month's rent on that unit. When things went her way, however, she could have the eviction squad physically remove tenants within 10 days. Once she was through security, Sharina made her way to room 400, Milwaukee County Small Claims Court, the busiest courtroom in the state. Her footsteps clacked on the marble floors and echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She passed lawyers in trench coats staring at the floor and talking on their cell phones, and young parents with children gaping like tourists. The courtroom was full. Women and men were squeezed into long wooden pews and stood lining the walls, their bodies warming the chamber. Sharina looked for a seat, waving at landlords she recognized. At the back of the courtroom, landlords were talking tenants into stipulation agreements, offering to dismiss evictions if tenants caught up on the rent. One, a white man in a leather jacket who had been in the local paper a few months back for racking up hundreds of property violations, was joking with his young female assistant when a tenant approached. The tenant was a black woman, likely in her 50s. Her shoulders were uplifted under her worn overcoat. She reached into her purse and handed the landlord $700 in cash. Quote, "I'm hoping," end quote, she began. The landlord cut her off. Quote, "Don't hope, write the check," end quote. Quote, "I can get you another 600 in 2 weeks," end quote. The landlord asked her to sign a stipulation, which included a $55 late fee. She reached for his pen. Toward the front of the room, in a toward the front of the room, in a reserved space with tables and plenty of empty chairs, sat lawyers in pinstripe suits and power ties. They had been hired by landlords. Some sat with manila folders stacked in front of them, reading the paper or filling in the crossword. Others joked with the bailiff, who periodically broke conversation to tell a tenant to remove his hat or lower her voice. Everyone in the reserved space, the lawyers and bailiff, was white. In front of the lawyers, a large wooden desk faced the crowd. Two women sat on either side of the desk, calling out the day's cases and taking attendance. Most of the names flung into the air went unclaimed. Roughly 70% of tenants summoned to Milwaukee's eviction court didn't come. The same was true in other major cities. In some urban courts, only 1 in 10 tenants showed up. Some tenants couldn't miss work or couldn't find childcare or were confused by the whole process or couldn't care less or would rather avoid the humiliation. When tenants did not show up and their landlord or a representative did, the caller applied 3 quick stamps to the file, indicating that the tenant had received a default eviction judgment and placed it on top of a growing pile. The sound of eviction court was a soft hum of dozens of people sighing, coughing, murmuring, and whispering to children, interspersed with the cadence of a name, a pause, and 3 loud thumps of the stamp. Okay. And here, let's take a moment to reflect there. This reminds me of my last time in court, and it was, of course, it was not eviction court, but I have been to eviction court. I don't remember the demographics of the people at that court date as well as I do the most recent court dates that I've been to, and there have been multiple times where everybody I'm in the courtroom with uh, is white except for the people who are being prosecuted. The state's attorney's white, the judge is white, the public defenders or the lawyers are white, the bailiff's white, and it just sort of reemphasizes to you how many things in this country are dictated by race and are dictated by personal prejudices and personal biases. And because specific institutions and specific structures have and continue to be dominated by white people, there is a white bias that continues to be at play. And then even the fact of so many people not showing up. It's the same thing with so many of these uh, judicial processes. People just don't show up, or people sign away their rights. People just don't understand what's going on, or people just want to be finished with whatever's going on. That's how plea deals end up getting uh, being used so often in criminal cases. And And so those are all just some of the things that initially stand out to me from that first part of the chapter. Behind the front desk, framed between two granite wooden columns, hung a large painting of Moses descending Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments unbroken. He glared down at the Israelites in the desert, dancing around the golden calf. Doorways on either side of the caller's desk led to commissioners' offices, where the actual hearings took place. When their case was called, landlords and tenants walked through a side doorway, usually to emerge just a few minutes later. A black woman whose hearing had just concluded stepped back into the room, holding her child's hand. Her head was wrapped, and she had kept on her heavy blue winter coat. She continued down the middle aisle of room 400, walking by an anemic white man with homemade tattoos, a white woman in a wheelchair wearing pajama pants and Crocs, a blind black man with a limp hat on his lap, a Hispanic man wearing work boots and a shirt that read, "Pray for us," all waiting for their eviction cases. Tenants in eviction court were generally poor, and almost all of them, 92%, had missed rent payments. The majority spent at least half their household income on rent. Okay, let me try this again. The majority spent at least half their household income on rent. 1/3 devoted at least 80% to it. Of the tenants who did come to court and were evicted, only 1 in 6 had another place lined up: shelters or the apartments of friends or family. A few resigned themselves to the streets. Most simply did not know where they would go. The woman in the blue winter coat found the face of another black woman sitting at the end of a pew. As she passed, she bent down and whispered, quote, "Don't worry, it only takes a minute, honey," end quote. As usual, the courtroom was full of black women. In a typical month, 3 in 4 people in Milwaukee eviction courts were black. Of those, 3 in 4 were women. The total number of black women in eviction court exceeded that of all other groups combined. Children of all ages encircled these women. A girl with a full box of barrettes in her hair sat quietly, swinging her legs under the pew. A dark-skinned boy in a collar shirt 2 sizes too big sat up straight and wore a hard face. His sister next to him tried to sleep, folding one arm over her eyes and clutching a stuffed dog in the other. In Milwaukee's poorest black neighborhoods, eviction had become commonplace, especially for women. In those neighborhoods, one female renter in 17 was evicted through the court system each year, which was twice as often as men from those neighborhoods and 9 times as often as women from the city's poorest white areas. Women from black neighborhoods made up 9% of Milwaukee's population and 30% of its evicted tenants. If incarceration had come to define the lives of men from impoverished black neighborhoods, eviction was shaping the lives of women. Poor black men were locked up, poor black women were locked out. And here, let's have a reflection here and then we'll continue back reading. What stands out to me is the unique vulnerability that black women in Milwaukee have. And I think that the writer did a great job of speaking about how of really giving you a feeling of what it's like in these courtrooms at these eviction cases, and also giving you a glimpse of who it is who experiences this the most. And again, whenever I hear statistics about black women, I'm always reminded of uh, the statistic of how black women are 3 times as often to die giving birth. Uh, I've been reading a book called A Peculiar Indifference by Elliot Curry, The Neglected Toll of Violence on Black America, for our Rockford Reading visualization episodes. And in there, they talk about how much more likely black women are to die at the hands of gun violence than white women, or even at times white men. And it's just a reminder that we have to be cognizant of intersectionality in our struggles, because that black women are uniquely vulnerable and are uh, and fall through the cracks in different ways than black men, but still fall through those cracks as well. And at times, there's less of a light shown on some of the cracks that they end up falling through because of things like sexism and misogyny. Okay, let's keep reading. A commissioner appeared from a side doorway and took a file from a caller. Sharina tapped her foot, waiting her turn. At the beginning of the month, she had been in court for 8 eviction cases, including Patrice's. Only one tenant made it, Ricky One Leg. He limped up to Sharina in the hallway and complained, quote, "Why you drag me down here?" End quote. Ricky had a high-pitched, sandpaper voice, beer on his breath, and a wooden leg he'd received after being shot 4 times on his 22nd birthday. Quote, "What? You want me to punch you in your other leg?" End quote. Sharina shot back. She raised her fist, and Ricky pretended to stab her foot with his cane. After they finished laughing, Sharina said, quote, "I love you, Ricky," end quote. Quote, "I love you too, baby," end quote. Quote, "You know, this is just a formality. You know you can't go to the grocery store and say, well, I'm going to take that food and I ain't paying you shit," end quote. Quote, "I know, baby. If I had a business, I would feel the same way. My daddy always told me you don't bite the hand that feeds you," end quote. When it was time, Sharina and Ricky approached the front bench. Since cases were grouped by plaintiffs, landlords, a caller made sure Sharina's other tenants weren't there. Quote, "Cecil Clement," end quote, "stamp, stamp, stamp." Quote, "Patrice Hinkston," end quote, "stamp, stamp, stamp." Patrice had gone to work at Cousin Subs instead of going to court. She couldn't find anyone who would swap hours, and she didn't want to lose this job. Her manager had looked past her Class A misdemeanor, writing bad checks. The only thing she liked about working at Cousins was her commute, a peaceful hour-long bus ride through streets lined with brick houses and mounted American flags. Quote, "F her and F the court," end quote, Patrice later said. Quote, my mom has been like through an eviction before, and the judge that she had was rude," end quote. Patrice will begin her rental career with an eviction record. She didn't give that much thought. Quote, "Everybody I know, except for my white friends, I swear they got an eviction on their record," end quote. Patrice knew that if she did come to court, she not only would lose work hours and frustrate her manager, but also would have to defend herself against someone who was more educated, more familiar with the law, and more comfortable in court. Other tenants had it worse, having to go toe-to-toe with their landlords as lawyer. Plus, Patrice would have to set foot in that grand old courthouse. The nicest building in Patrice's life was Lena's Food Market off Fond du Lac Avenue. It had shopping carts, bright fluorescent lights, and a buff linoleum floor. Her white friends called it the ghetto grocery store, but it was one of the better markets on the north side. And at Lena's, Patrice never felt her existence questioned. She tried not to go to parts of the city where she did. Patrice lived 4 miles away from the shore of Lake Michigan, an hour on foot, a half hour by bus, 15 minutes by car. She had never been. Okay, that brings us to a changing of the theme in this chapter again. And let me see how many pages we got left. We might just end this episode here. Okay, yeah, this is what we're going to do. We're going to end this episode here, and then it's a little shorter, but we'll start back tomorrow's episode by completing this chapter, and that will end part 1 of Evicted. So please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Make sure you're on the lookout for tomorrow's episode of Rockford Reading Daily. If you have not listened to previous episodes, please go listen to those. If by the time you listen to this, there's future episodes out besides tomorrow's, please go listen to that as well. And remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Holla at you tomorrow.